Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Alyssa Antony. I'm an international student here at Bangor University, currently pursuing my master's in counseling. So, today I'll be sharing my research on how culture shapes the way individuals experience therapy. This topic is deeply personal to me. It actually began with my own experiences and gradually evolved into an academic curiosity, one that I've been fortunate enough to explore through this research. So, a bit about me: I was born and raised in Malaysia, a society rooted in collectivistic values. So, in our culture, concepts like group harmony, familial duty, interdependence, and community plays a central role in how we understand our emotions and our relationships. But coming to the UK to pursue my counseling training, I was placed in an environment that was in many ways opposite of what I had known and grown up with. Here I encountered a strong emphasis on individuality, self-worth, self-expression, personal independence, values that stand in contrast to the collectivistic principles I was raised with. Being part of such a diverse academic environment, surrounded by students and peers all over the globe, each with their own cultural lens, this made me start to reflect a little bit more critically on therapy as we know it. So, how universal is the model that we are learning, and how might culture alter not only how therapy is practiced, but how it is experienced? These are the faces and minds behind some of the most profound theories in psychology today. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychology, taught us that uncovering unconscious desires would lead to healing, placing emphasis on insight and inner drives. Carl Rogers, the father of person-centered therapy, championed authenticity, self-actualization, self-expression, and the belief that each person has the capacity for personal growth. Carl Jung explored personal meaning, symbolism, and individuality. Last but not least, B.F. Skinner saw behavior as something shaped by rewards and reinforcement, a more external approach, but still one rooted in individual control. Each of these approaches laid the foundation for modern counseling, but they are also very culturally specific as they were shaped in an individualistic Western society. The reality today looks very different, especially in places like universities where students come from all over the world, bringing their own cultural values, expectations, and ideas of well-being. Therefore, we chose to design our study in this setting, asking, does cultural orientation play a role in therapy satisfaction among UK university students? Previous research has consistently shown that when there's a cultural mismatch between therapist and client, the quality of the therapeutic experience can be significantly affected. Naz and his colleagues found that Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds in UK often reported dissatisfaction with CBT, specifically due to the therapist's failure to display cultural sensitivity. Similarly, Phillips and Andropoulou reported that South Asian women in the UK saw therapy as culturally irrelevant when their therapists lacked awareness of their social and familial norms. Several other studies also showed that even subtle cultural misunderstandings, such as overlooking family obligations or indirect communication styles, would reduce trust, engagement, and overall therapy satisfaction. Altogether, these findings highlight the importance of cultural sensitivity and its awareness in therapeutic settings, especially when working with clients from collectivistic backgrounds. While the earlier research mentioned paints a clear picture of cultural mismatch, more recent studies suggest a shift, particularly among younger globalized populations. Research by Guo, Hyman-Court, and Lee points to the growing flexibility in how students engage with cultural identity. As internationalization and cross-cultural interaction increase, many young people are developing more fluid, hybrid, or bicultural identities. For example, students from collectivistic cultures may adopt traits like emotional openness or self-advocacy, values that are traditionally associated with individualism, but they're still holding on to their cultural roots. Gaitan Agwala and Tumala Nara suggest that these evolving identities may allow for greater adaptability in therapeutic settings. However, adaptability should not be mistaken with full alignment. Beneath surface-level openness, core cultural values still shape how therapy is experienced, particularly around trust, emotion, and relational connection with the therapist. To better understand the impact of culture on therapy, we need to step back and actually talk about what culture is. So, culture is more than a nationality or an ethnicity, it is a system of meaning. It shapes how we relate to others, how we express distress, how we communicate with people, how we seek help, and how we define our healing. A foundational model that helps us understand this better is Hofstede's individualism collectivism dimension. Hofstede's work was one of the first large scale empirical studies of cross cultural behavior. It revealed that cultures differ in how much they prioritize the self versus the group, autonomy versus interdependence. In individualistic cultures like the UK, the US, and parts of Western Europe, therapy tends to center around autonomy, emotional disclosure, and personal growth. Mental health is often framed as a personal journey towards empowerment and self understanding.
But in collectivistic cultures, such as those in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, these cultures emphasize harmony, group loyalty, and relational roles. So, in these contexts, distress is often viewed not just as a personal issue, but as something that involves the whole family or the whole community. Emotional expression may be more indirect or even somatic, and therapy itself may be approached with caution due to concerns around family honor or social stigma. But even within these broad categories, not all collectivists or individualists are the same. This is where the work of Harry Trandis becomes especially useful. Trandis expands on Hofstede's model by adding a second dimension, horizontal versus vertical orientation. In horizontal orientation, these cultures value equality, whether that means individual independence or group harmony. For vertical cultures, these cultures accept hierarchy, linking status to achievement or loyalty. This creates four cultural orientations: horizontal individualism, vertical individualism, horizontal collectivism, and vertical collectivism. Let's have a look at these dimensions separately to better understand the measures used in this research. So, horizontal individualism is an orientation that values independence, but with a belief that everyone should be treated equally. These individuals don't seek status, they just want the freedom to be themselves without hierarchy or competition. Think of someone who values personal space and choice, but doesn't care about outshining others. For vertical individualism, people still value independence, but they also accept or seek out competition and status. Success, ambition, and standing out are the key here. Picture someone who works hard to climb the career ladder and sees personal achievement as a reflection of self worth. For horizontal collectivism, this group values belonging to a group like family, community, or close knit peers, but within an environment where everyone is seen as equal. So think of a close group of friends or a team that makes decisions together. The focus is on harmony, cooperation, and equality within the group. Lastly, vertical collectivism. This group also values belonging and loyalty to a group. But here, hierarchy matters. People respect elders, people respect leaders or social roles, and group loyalty often involves fulfilling your responsibilities within a clear structure. So picture a traditional family where the younger members defer to the older members, or even a workplace where loyalty to the organization is tied to respect for authority. So while two people might both value family or both want independence, how they relate to others, whether as equals or within a hierarchy, changes how they experience the world. And that's exactly what this study explored: whether these deeper cultural orientations affect how satisfied students feel with therapy. Now that we've explored the theoretical framework behind the study, let's take a closer look at how the research was conducted. So our study employed a quantitative independent measures design using a cross-sectional correlational framework. The independent variables of the study included cultural group, cultural orientation scores, and nationality group. The dependent variable was therapy satisfaction, operationalized as the total mean score on the satisfaction with therapy and therapist scale revised.
Our final sample consisted of 82 participants. All participants were current or former university students who had accessed therapy services in the UK. As part of the survey, participants were asked to provide basic demographic information. This included their age, gender, nationality, and ethnicity. All responses were anonymized to maintain confidentiality. Here you can see a breakdown of the sample by gender and ethnicity. So in terms of gender, the sample was predominantly female with 76%, followed by male participants at 21% and non-binary and self-identified individuals at 3%. Ethnically, the sample was diverse. 42% were white, 38% were Asian or Asian British, and 20% were Black or mixed ethnicity. This demographic spread allowed for a meaningful exploration of how cultural values might influence therapy satisfaction across different identity groups. So the first measure used was the individual collectivism scale developed by Trandis and Gelfand in 1998. As mentioned in the introduction of this presentation, this is a widely used instrument designed to assess an individual's cultural orientation across the four dimensions we explored earlier. Participants responded to a series of statements on a Likert scale, indicating the extent to which they identified with values like autonomy, equality, loyalty, and social hierarchy. Using the scale enabled our study not only to assess individual cultural orientation, but also to group participants according to the cultural values they endorsed most strongly with. This was essential for later comparisons in satisfaction levels, which will be discussed in our results section. The second measure was the satisfaction with therapy and therapist scale. This is a 12-item scale used to assess client satisfaction with the therapeutic experience. It evaluates areas such as perceived effectiveness, comfort in therapy process, and the quality of the client and therapist relationship. So now we move on to the procedure of our research. The study firstly received full ethical approval from the Bangor University School of Psychology Research Ethics Community and was created in line with the British Psychological Society guidelines. Participants were recruited through Bangor University Sona system or through social media using our digital recruitment poster. After clicking the survey link, they were redirected to the survey platform, SciToolkit, and were presented with an online information sheet and were asked to give electronic consent before beginning. All responses, as mentioned earlier, were anonymous, and participants were allowed to withdraw at any point of the survey. A final debrief screen explained the study in more detail and included contact information for support, for mental health support, and also for any questions to be redirected to the research team. After providing consent, participants then went on to complete demographic questions, followed by 2 fixed order measures, the individualism collectivism scale and the satisfaction with therapy and therapist scale on the SciToolkit platform. Data was then automatically recorded and exported into SPSS for data analysis. Now that we covered our methodology, let's move on to the more exciting part of the research, the results section. I first grouped the participants according to their cultural orientation after totaling their scores from the individual collectivism scale. So the results, as you can see here, show that the biggest group identified with horizontal collectivism at 33%, the second biggest group identified with vertical individualism at 28%, and the third group was a tie, which meant that the participants that identified here had equal scores across all 4 dimensions. And this was 27% of the population. Lastly, the smallest group was vertical collectivism at 12%. Interestingly, our population did not have any participant identify fully under horizontal individualism. The mean satisfaction levels of the sample showed that satisfaction was generally high, with an average score of 3.91 out of 5. So we knew that in general, the sample had a positive perception of their therapy experience in the UK, but that was just the starting point of my analysis. Upon understanding the satisfaction levels of the general population, I wanted to then understand how satisfaction changed depending on the participant's cultural orientation. So to explore this, I ran a one-way ANOVA, which compares the average satisfaction across 4 cultural groups. This test allowed me to see whether horizontal collectivists or vertical individualists would have any measurable impact on therapy satisfaction. The results weren't statistically significant, but there were interesting trends observed. For example, vertical collectivists reported the lowest satisfaction, while the group labeled tie had the highest satisfaction level. So while the differences weren't strong enough to confirm statistically, this pattern suggested that culture might be influencing satisfaction in more subtle ways. I then moved beyond group averages and performed a multiple regression analysis to help me identify which specific cultural orientations were predicting satisfaction levels. This allowed me to treat culture as a spectrum rather than fixed categories and an opportunity to see which values mattered most in the population. The model was statistically significant, explaining nearly 30% of the variance in therapy satisfaction. Here's what was found. Participants who strongly identified with horizontal collectivism, meaning they value group connection and equality, tended to report higher satisfaction levels. Participants who identified as vertical individualists, those who value ambition and status, also reported higher satisfaction. On the contrary, participants from vertical collectivism, those who prioritize group loyalty and hierarchy, reported a negative relationship, thus revealing lower satisfaction scores. This gave me a better understanding of what values contributed to the satisfaction levels. Lastly, I wanted to test the broader cultural categories that appeared in the literature and see how it fared in my research. When I grouped participants as individualists or collectivists, there was no significant difference, as you can see from the first bar graph. This suggests that simplifying people into these 2 camps might miss the more subtle influences we saw in the regression earlier. So then I decided to compare Western versus non-Western participants, and there was indeed a significant difference. Western participants reported significantly higher satisfaction with therapy than their non-Western peers. This result aligns with the literature, which suggests that Western therapy models may still align more closely with Western cultural values, even in diverse university settings. Let's now explore what this result tells us. This study explored how cultural orientation impacts therapy satisfaction among UK university students. In conducting this research, I drew on Triandi's cultural dimensional model, which offered a more nuanced lens through which to understand the relationship between cultural values and therapy satisfaction. One of the key findings of the research was that individuals who identified with horizontal collectivism reported high levels of satisfaction in therapy. This challenges a long-held assumption in the literature that collectivistic values inherently clash with therapeutic settings. This finding tells us that when therapy reflects values such as connection, equality, and mutual respect, as is often the case with person-centered therapy, even individuals from collectivistic backgrounds might actually feel more comfortable, understood, and engaged in therapy. On the other hand, participants who identified with vertical collectivism, which emphasizes hierarchy, duty, and deference to authority, reported lower levels of satisfaction with therapy in Western contexts. This might reflect a cultural mismatch as Western therapeutic models often prioritize openness, equality, and individual autonomy, with little emphasis on values such as familial duty, hierarchical structure, or group obligation. Finally, participants who identified with vertical individualism also reported high levels of satisfaction with therapy, which was an expected outcome. This cultural orientation aligns most closely with key values emphasized in Western therapeutic approaches, such as autonomy, personal identity, growth, and individual agency. One of the most compelling findings from this research emerged from the comparison between Western and non-Western participants. Those from Western backgrounds reported significantly higher satisfaction with therapy, a result that aligns with Hofstede's framework, which highlights how values such as autonomy, emotional openness, and self-exploration are deeply embedded in individualistic cultures. These values are also the foundation of many Western therapeutic models, so it's unsurprising that Western participants felt more in sync with this therapeutic process. However, the low satisfaction reported by non-Western participants is just as important. It highlights how cultural divergence continues to shape the therapeutic experience in profound ways. This isn't about rejecting therapy. In fact, many participants from collectivistic cultures are engaging deeply with this process. They're learning the language of openness, autonomy, and individual growth. But even with that effort and adaptation, a noticeable satisfaction gap persists. This gap is meaningful. It tells us that even when clients enter therapy with openness and willingness, the process itself may still be shaped by structural assumptions that don't fully resonate with them. Assumptions about how we heal, who gets to speak, and whose pain is prioritized. This underscores the deeper message of this study. Cultural responsiveness isn't merely about acknowledging a client's background or values. It requires us to examine the very foundations of the therapeutic space, to question whose worldview it reflects and to whom it truly feels like home. As with any research, it is important to recognize the limitations of the study, not to weaken its impact, but to sharpen the focus for what comes next. Firstly, the study used self-report measures, which are efficient but can be shaped by social desirability, especially in cultures where expressing dissatisfaction may be seen as inappropriate. Some responses may reflect politeness rather than true emotional experiences, so the future studies could incorporate qualitative interviews or observational methods to gain deeper, more culturally grounded insights. Secondly, although cultural orientation was assessed using validated frameworks, identity is not a checklist. It is fluid, intersectional, and evolving. Our grouping system may not fully capture how people hold multiple overlapping cultural identities, especially for those navigating life between worlds. Future research could include variables like migration history, acculturation, or language fluency to better reflect this complexity. Lastly, the study didn't account for key therapeutic factors, such as therapy type, session frequency, or the therapist's background. These elements significantly shape the client experiences. So future work could explore how cultural training or different therapeutic approaches might influence outcomes for clients from diverse backgrounds. As someone training to be a counselor and living between cultures myself, this project wasn't academic, it was personal. What I've learned is that we can't assume therapy works the same way for everyone. This research has strengthened my belief that culturally responsive care is not a specialization, it's a standard. It asks us future counselors, researchers, and community members to meet people not just where they are, but how they are. I hope this research adds to the growing field of making therapy safer, more welcoming, and more relevant, not just for people who fit the mold, but for every person that walks through the door. And I invite you, whether you're a practitioner, a student, somebody passionate about mental health, to help shape a future where therapy doesn't just reflect one worldview, but holds space for many. Thank you so much for joining me today and for taking time to hear about my research. I hope you enjoy listening to the rest of my peers' presentation as well. If you have any thoughts or questions, I'd love to hear them. Please feel free to leave me a comment. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye.